I'm here at St. Stephen's Catholic Church in Portland, Oregon. Today is the second day in our novena to Our Lady of the Miraculous Medal. Yesterday we met little Zoe Labouré at 9 years old. Her mother had recently died, very young, and Zoe climbed a chair, found a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary, took it down, hugged her, and said, "Now you will be my mother." And then she put the statue back, and that was that. Mary was her mother. And she longed to see Mary, and she believed that she would. Well, let's continue then. We'll skip ahead to an excerpt here from chapter 3 of the book, St. Catherine Labouré of the Miraculous Medal by Father Joseph Dirvin. Now, from the time of her first communion then, little Zoe Labouré spoke about having a vocation. She talked to her little sister, Marie Antoinette, whom she affectionately called Tonine. She was 2.5 years older than Tonine. Now, Zoe had a long-range plan. It would be years before she went into religious life. But in the meantime, her intention one day to embrace the religious life was her chief motive for training Tonine in the role of housekeeper. Because when Tonine would be old enough to take over the care of the house, then, Zoe decided, she herself would go off to fulfill her vocation. Now keep in mind that they have older siblings because their parents had been married, I think, for 22 years at the time that the mother died, or they'd been married for some time. So the mother was 42. Yeah, I think they'd been married like 22 years or so. So there were older children, and in fact, she had an older sister, Marie-Louise, one of her oldest siblings, who was who had entered the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul. So that's the situation. And then there are many children in between until you get to young Zoe and then Tonine. And then there was one more baby who had poor health. Now, it would be many years then, but Zoe was preparing her little sister to take over so that when she came of age, she could move out and enter the religious life. Well, she didn't mention anything about her vocation to anyone other than her little sister. And she was even good friends with the sister superior at the Sisters of Charity there in their village. But she never said a word to her about it either. And she would do volunteer work there with the Sisters of Charity, visiting the poor and the sick. And it was clear to the sister of the religious community that Zoe had a vocation. But it was not the way of the Sisters of Charity to go looking for vocations. They didn't ever ask anyone or recommend somebody to join. That wasn't their way. It was a matter of attraction, but without pushing it on anyone. So, it just so happens that one night in 1824, when she was 18 years old, Zoe had an extraordinary dream. She dreamed that she was in her favorite oratory, the chapel of the Labourés in the village church, assisting at the Mass of an old and venerable priest she had never seen before. And each time the priest turned from the altar for the Dominus Vobiscum, he raised his eyes to Zoe's face and held her gaze. And each time she was forced to lower her eyes, blushing, unable to hold the steady and compelling eyes of the priest. And when the Mass was over, and the old man had started for the sacristy, he turned back and beckoned to Zoe to follow him. Well, she was suddenly very frightened, and jumping to her feet, ran from the church. She glanced back over her shoulder as she ran, and the priest was still there, standing by the sacristy door, looking after her. And then the thought came to Zoe in her dream to stop to visit a woman of the village who was sick. And on entering the sick room, she came face to face with the same venerable priest. And wild fright seized her again, and she began to back away. For the first time then, the priest spoke directly to her. "You do well to visit the sick, my child. You flee from me now, but one day you will be glad to come to me. God has plans for you. Do not forget it." And at these words, Zoe awoke and lay wondering what it could all mean. And strangely enough, there was no more fear in her, only peace and comfort and a great happiness. Although she did not understand it then, this dream was sent Zoe by God to point out with certainty the vocation of his choice. And Zoe told no one about the dream, not even Tonine. She recounted it for the first time to her confessor in Châtillon some 4 years later, when she began to realize what it meant. And out of the confessional, she spoke of it only toward the end of her life, nearly 50 years later, when, in a sudden transport of joy, she recounted this vivid and mysterious dream to Marie-Louise, her older sister, whom she had gone to visit in the infirmary of the mother house of the Sisters of Charity on the Rue de Bac. So, nobody knew about this dream. Nobody knew about this dream for 50 years. All right then. Well, in the meantime, Zoe had several proposals of marriage, and her father was pretty pleased. There was one young man in particular who was from a good family, and Zoe was from a good family. She was an ideal wife for a farmer, and her parents had been prosperous as farmers, not luxurious, but prosperous, a good family. And Zoe, while not being beautiful, was pleasing. She was pleasing in her looks. She had beautiful blue eyes. Well, she turned down the marriage proposals one by one, and her father did not press her to consent, and he was highly pleased that his favorite child was desirable. Now, Tonine, 17 years old at the time, was puzzled why her older sister had turned down these proposals of marriage. And she asked, "Will you never marry?" And Zoe answered, I shall never marry. I am promised to Jesus Christ." "Then you haven't changed," Tonine persisted. "I haven't changed." All her life, change would be the last thing to expect of Zoe Labouré. There were at least 2 more proposals of marriage, and they came to the same impasse. Now, when Zoe had reached the age of 22, she sat down and took stock of her situation. She had done her duty. She had served her father faithfully and well. Tonine was 20 years old. She was capable of handling the household alone. And so Zoe decided to ask her father if she could enter religious life, and her father said no. No. Well, now what? Well, I guess you'll have to tune in tomorrow to find out the rest of the story. Let us now continue with our novena prayer, and you can click on the link in the description below the video to print out the novena prayer, and you can also click on another link to pray the novena prayer along with me right here before the Mary altar. Well, I look forward to seeing you tomorrow for the day 3 in this novena, and don't miss a day of prayer with us.